rain hammered against the cracked pavement as Detective Alex Vane stepped under the yellow tape. The alley reeked of copper and damp brick. The victim, a middle-aged banker, sat propped against the dumpster with his hands folded in a mockery of prayer. Carved into his chest was a symbol Vane didn't recognize, a spiral within a triangle bleeding freely. This was the third such scene in as many months. The press had dubbed him the Carver, but Vane knew him as something worse, a ghost. No fingerprints, no DNA, just the stench of jasmine, cologne, and precision. Vane knelt, his knees popping in the cold, studying the cut, surgical. The killer had medical knowledge or immense patience. As the flashbulbs popped around him, Vane felt the familiar weight of being outpaced. The Carver was always 3 steps ahead, leaving these tableaus not for the police, but for the city to fear. Fear was growing like mold in the wet streets of Blackwood. Vane touched the victim's wrist, still warm. He had missed him by minutes, again. The killer was watching from somewhere close. Vane could feel it, a prickling on his neck. He looked up at the rooftops, seeing only shadows. The game had begun long before Vane arrived, and he was already losing. He stood, wiping blood on his coat, vowing to catch the monster, unaware that the monster was learning him just as fast, studying his every move with patience that matched his own. The morgue was cold, sterile light reflecting off steel tables. Dr. Chen pulled back the sheet revealing the second victim, a schoolteacher named Mary Holt, the same spiral triangle carved into her sternum, the same jasmine scent rising from her clothes. But this time there was a note, sealed in plastic, tucked into her folded hands. Vane read it with shaking hands. "You look in the wrong places, detective. You look for me, but I am looking through you." The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. Vane's jaw tightened. The killer wasn't just aware of the investigation. He was mocking it, feeding on the attention. Forensics had found nothing but the cologne, a brand discontinued 10 years ago. A dead end manufactured by a brilliant mind. Vane stared at the note, realizing the ink was fresh, the paper expensive cotton stock. The killer had been here in this building, perhaps watching the autopsy from the ventilation vents. The thought made Vane's skin crawl. He was being outmaneuvered at every turn, playing catch-up in a maze designed by a madman who knew the exits before the walls were built. He pocketed the note, knowing it was evidence but feeling it was a personal letter, a love note from the abyss itself. The envelope arrived at Vane's apartment Tuesday morning, slid under the door like a whisper. His name was written on the front in that same elegant script. Inside, a single photograph, Vane's daughter's gravestone, covered in fresh rain. Lily had died 5 years ago, a car accident that Vane had never fully accepted as accidental. Now the killer had desecrated her memory, standing on hallowed ground to take the picture. Rage blinded Vane for a moment, a red haze descending. He turned the photograph over. She was beautiful, pity about the breaks. Vane crashed his fist into the wall, plaster crumbling. The killer knew. He knew about the grief, the guilt, the hollow space in Vane's chest. This wasn't random, it was intimate, a surgical strike at his psyche. Vane called for a protective detail on his ex-wife, though they hadn't spoken in years. He knew he was being driven by emotion now, which was dangerous, but he also knew he had to engage. The hunter had become the hunted in a psychological sense, and the killing grounds were expanding from the streets into the corridors of his own trauma. He sat in the dark, waiting. The whiskey bottle stood untouched. He needed clarity now, not oblivion, for the monster was at the gates. The stakeout was a disaster. Vane had predicted the next location, an abandoned textile factory, based on the geometric alignment of the first 2 bodies. He sat for 6 hours in the freezing dark, his partner Doyle snoring softly in the passenger seat. At 3 a.m. his phone rang, not the precinct, a blocked number. "You're sitting in the cold for nothing, Alex," the voice said. It was smooth, modulated, inhumanly calm. "I'm watching your wife sleep. She snores like Doyle." Vane's blood turned to ice. He floored the accelerator, sirens wailing, racing across town to the house he'd barely shared with Karen. The door was unlocked. On the pillow where Karen's head should have been, there was a single red rose and a fresh carving of the spiral triangle on the headboard. She was safe at her sister's, but the violation was absolute. The killer had been inside, touching her things, scenting her air. Vane checked every closet, every shadow, but the game was clear. The killer could reach anyone, anywhere. The rules of engagement had shifted from catching a criminal to surviving a predator who knew the terrain of Vane's life better than he did himself. He sat on the bed, defeated, the red petals falling like drops of blood onto the white sheets. The third victim broke all patterns. He was found not in the streets, but locked inside his own panic room, a reinforced steel cube in his penthouse apartment. No windows, one door sealed from the inside, yet there he sat, hands folded, symbol carved, dead for 12 hours. The security footage showed no entry, no exit, just a glitch in the camera at 2:13 a.m., a second of static, and then the room was occupied by a corpse. Vane studied the walls, the vents, the ceiling. Impossible. The killer had demonstrated supernatural patience and skill, bypassing a vault that bank robbers couldn't crack. He's a ghost, Doyle muttered. Vane touched the body, ice cold. On the victim's phone, deleted but recoverable, was a text sent to himself. Admit you're beaten. Vane realized the killer wasn't just killing. He was proving a point about control, about the illusion of safety. Every locked door was a challenge, every security system a puzzle to be dismantled. The city's wealthy were panic-buying guns and guards, but Vane knew it wouldn't matter. The Carver chose his victims not for their sins, but for their locks. The harder the fortress, the sweeter the penetration. Vane left the penthouse feeling that the air itself was compromised, that safety was a myth the killer delighted in dispelling. Vane started dreaming of the Carver, not as a man, but as a shadow that stood at the foot of his bed, smelling of jasmine and copper. He would wake with the scent in his nostrils, checking his own chest for marks. The department forced him to take a psych evaluation. He passed by lying. He couldn't stop now. A break came from an unlikely source, a fiber found under the third victim's fingernail. White cotton, high thread count, specific to medical scrubs. The killer was a doctor, or posing as one. Vane subpoenaed every hospital record for personnel on shift during the murders, 300 names. He worked through the night, cross-referencing, eliminating. By dawn, he had 20 possibles. By noon, 5. But when he arrived at the apartment of the first suspect, a cardiac surgeon named Elias Thorne, he found the man already dead, posed in his own shower, the spiral triangle fresh on his skin. The Carver had anticipated the deduction, sacrificed a pawn to mislead the investigation. Another dead end, another taunt. Vane sat in his car, realizing that every clue led only to more death, that the killer was feeding him breadcrumbs laced with poison. He was being played like an instrument, and the melody was madness. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, swearing that this time he would find the thread that led to the spider, not the web. The fourth body was discovered in the precinct's own parking garage. A beat cop, young, enthusiastic, found propped against Vane's car door. The killer had come to the lion's den. The audacity was breathtaking. On the windshield, written in the condensation, was a message, closer but still behind. The Chinese letter killer got past security cameras and armed officers was a mystery that terrified the entire department. If he could kill here, he could kill anywhere. The chief put Vane on mandatory leave. He was too close, too involved, becoming a liability. Vane refused to go home. He rented a motel room under a false name. Cutting himself off from everyone, he spread the case files across the bed, the photographs, the notes, the fibers. He saw the pattern now, not in the victims, but in the locations. If you mapped them, they formed a spiral on the city grid, tightening toward the center. The center was the old Blackwood Asylum, abandoned for decades. It was a trap, obviously a trap, but it was also the first time the killer had shown him the finish line. Vane loaded his gun and drove through the rain, knowing he was walking into the lion's jaws, but hoping this time he could shoot the beast before it bit. The wheels of his sedan hissed on the wet pavement, carrying him toward a confrontation that had been inevitable from the very first drop of spilled blood. The asylum was a cathedral of decay, its halls choked with dust and the scent of old suffering. Vane moved through the dark with his flashlight and weapon drawn, every shadow seeming to twitch. He found the fifth victim in the electroshock therapy room, a mannequin dressed in Vane's own clothes from his locker at the precinct, the spiral carved into its wooden face. On the table beside it was a file, Vane's file. His daughter's accident report, his divorce papers, his psychiatric evaluation from years ago. The killer had been collecting him, studying him, knowing his weaknesses better than Vane knew himself. "You shouldn't have come alone," a voice echoed from the loudspeaker system, crackling with static. It was the same voice from the phone. "But I knew you would. The obsessive ones always do." Vane spun, trying to locate the source. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice trembling with a rage he couldn't control. "Not yet. First, admit you admire me. Admit that without me, you are nothing but a drunk with a badge." The words cut deeper than any knife. Vane fired his weapon into the speaker, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, then laughter fading into the walls. The mistake was Vane's. He had revealed his location, his anger, his breaking point. He lowered the smoking gun, realizing that the echo of his shot was the only answer he would receive from the darkness. Vane found the underground tunnels, a labyrinth beneath the asylum that wasn't on any blueprint. The air grew colder, the walls wet. He heard footsteps ahead, soft and deliberate. He gave chase, turning corners blindly, his flashlight beam bouncing off brick and rusted iron. The figure ahead wore a gray hooded coat, moving with terrible speed and grace. "Stop." "Police," Vane yelled, though the command sounded hollow in his own ears. The figure turned a corner, Vane followed, bursting into a circular chamber. Empty, just a table with a tape recorder. He pressed play. You run well, Alex. But you breathe too loud, I can hear your heart from here. A trapdoor slammed shut above him, metal on metal. He was locked in. The lights, bare bulbs strung from the ceiling, flickered on. He was in a cell. On the walls were photos of the victims, but now including photos of Karen, of Doyle, of Vane himself sleeping in the motel. The killer had been watching him sleep. The violation was total. You have 12 hours of oxygen, the voice said. Or you can use the key, it's in the water. Vane looked at the puddle on the floor, something glinted. He reached down, pulling out a key, but attached to it was a severed finger. He vomited, the horror finally breaking his professional composure. He was not the hunter here, he was the final exhibit. 12 hours, Vane spent the first hour trying to pick the lock with the bone fragments from the finger, his hands slick with sweat and bile. The second hour he screamed. By the third he was silent, calculating. He noticed a pattern in the bricks, one was loose, worn smooth by time. He worked at it with the key, scraping away mortar. It took 4 hours, his fingernails tearing, but he pulled the brick free. Behind it a passage too small for a man, but large enough for air and perhaps a signal. He shoved his flashlight through, blinking it in SOS. Doyle, against orders, had followed him to the asylum, had seen his car. Doyle was above, searching. The light caught his attention. The rescue took 2 more hours, Doyle and a SWAT team cutting through the metal trapdoor with torches. When they pulled Vane out, he was gray with dust and dehydration, clutching the severed finger in an evidence bag. He made a mistake, Vane rasped, his throat dry as sand. The finger, it's his. He cut it off to mock me, but it has his DNA, his prints. He got careless in his arrogance. The finger went to the lab. The killer had finally left a piece of himself behind, a trophy turned traitor. The spiral was tightening, but now it was tightening around the killer's own neck. The DNA came back within 48 hours. Silas Crowe, former surgical prodigy, burned out after a malpractice scandal that killed 3 patients. He had vanished 5 years ago, presumed dead in a boating accident. Now they had a name, a face from old photographs, a history of medical brilliance twisted into surgical sadism. Vane studied the file, seeing the connections. The precision, the medical knowledge, the padded cells of the asylum. Crowe's father had been a patient there. This was homecoming. Vane ignored the hospital orders, the IV in his arm, the sedatives. He dressed and went to the address linked to Crowe's last known alias, a brownstone in the University District. It was empty, cleared out, but in the fireplace, half burned, was a map, not of the city, but of Vane's life, his roots, his habits, his motel. Crowe had been planning this for months, years perhaps. On the mantelpiece, a single jasmine-scented candle burned, the wick fresh. He had been here hours ago, watching Vane recover in the hospital, then returning to his nest to wait. Vane touched the wax, still warm. "You're slipping, Silas," he whispered. "You left the candle, you left the map, you left your DNA. You're no longer perfect." The game had shifted. For the first time in months, Vane smiled. The fear was still there, but it was matched now by a predator's certainty. He knew the face of the devil, and he was coming for him. The manhunt consumed the city. Crowe's photograph was everywhere, subways, televisions, the internet. But he was a ghost with a face now, slipping through the net with ease that suggested preparation. 3 days passed. Then a letter arrived at the precinct, addressed to Vane. Inside, coordinates and a time, midnight, the old docks, come alone or the girl dies. There was a photograph of a teenage girl, a runaway named Sarah, whom Vane had helped years ago. She was alive, bound, gagged. The bait was obvious, a trap within a trap, but Vane had no choice. He went alone, as demanded, but wired for sound with Doyle listening from a van 2 blocks away. The docks were foggy, the water black and oily. Crowe stood at the end of a pier, silhouetted against the city lights, holding a knife to Sarah's throat. He was tall, thin, moves like a spider. "You're early," Crowe called out. "I like that." Eagerness to die, Vane walked forward, hands visible but close to his weapon. "Let her go, Silas, it's me you want." Crowe laughed, a high musical sound. "I don't want you dead, Alex, I want you to understand. That's why I left the finger, that's why I left the candle. I wanted you to find me. The final act requires an audience who appreciates the craft." Vane stopped 20 feet away. The water lapped at the pylons. This was the endgame. Vane could see the madness in Crowe's eyes, a glittering intelligence that had curdled into something purely predatory. "I understand you," Vane said, his voice steady despite the gun in his hand trembling slightly. "You're not an artist. You're a scared child who cuts people because you can't heal them. The malpractice, the deaths on your table, you've been trying to fix your failure by perfecting the art of ending lives." Crowe's smile faltered, a flicker of rage passing across his pale face. The knife pressed harder against Sarah's neck. A bead of blood appeared. "You know nothing of my pain," Crowe hissed. "You know nothing of the pressure, the perfection required. These people were broken. I perfected them. I made them art." "You made them dead," Vane countered, taking a step closer. And you made a mistake, the finger, you got arrogant. You think you're playing me, but I'm here to end you. Crowe shoved Sarah forward. She stumbled, fell toward the water. Vane fired not at Crowe, he was too close to the girl, but at the wooden planks near his feet. Crowe danced back, losing balance for a split second. It was enough. Sarah rolled away into the black water. Doyle's team erupted from the warehouses, lights blazing, shouting commands. But Crowe was already moving, not surrendering, but attacking. He lunged at Vane with the knife, expecting a soft target, a broken detective. He underestimated the rage Vane had tempered into cold steel. Vane sidestepped, using Crowe's momentum against him, and struck him hard across the face with the butt of his gun. Crowe fell but rolled, coming up in a crouch. The knife flashed. Vane fired again, the bullet grazing Crowe's shoulder, spinning him around. Blood sprayed on the wet wood, but Crowe didn't stop. He charged, screaming, not like a surgeon, but like an animal. They grappled at the edge of the pier, the dark water churning below. Vane felt the knife bite into his side, a hot line of pain, but he didn't let go. He drove his knee into Crowe's stomach again and again until the knife clattered to the dock. They were face to face now, panting, blood mixing in the rain. "You'll never be free of me," Crowe whispered, grinning through bloodied teeth. "Even in prison, I'll be in your head. Every shadow will be me." Vane head-butted him, breaking his nose with a sickening crunch. "You doesn't get prison," Vane spat. Doyle was shouting, closing in, but Vane had the advantage now. He pinned Crowe, pressing his face into the wooden planks, the smell of tar and blood filling his nostrils. He cuffed him tight enough to cut skin. The fight was over, but Vane knew Crowe was right. The haunting wouldn't end with cuffs. But for now, the killer was caught. The spree stopped. Vane collapsed beside him, clutching his bleeding side, watching the sky lighten with dawn. The fog began to lift, revealing the gray morning, and with it, the end of a nightmare that had gripped the city for far too long. But Silas Crowe was not finished. During transport to the prison hospital, he escaped. The ambulance was found crashed into a ravine, the guards sedated, not dead, Crowe's signature mercy to those he deemed innocent barriers. Vane, recovering from his stab wound in the hospital, got the call and ripped out his IV. The hunt was on again, but this time Vane had the scent. Crowe was wounded, bleeding, leaving a trail of droplets on asphalt. The mistake was hubris. Crowe, believing himself invincible, had gone to ground not in a new location, but to the place it all began, the Blackwood Asylum. He had returned to his cathedral to either recover or die. Vane knew it instantly. He drove there alone, refusing to wait for backup, knowing that if the SWAT teams descended, Crowe would vanish into the walls like a rat. This had to end one-on-one. The asylum was darker than before, the power cut. Vane moved through the basement tunnels with a flashlight and his gun, following the blood trail. It led to the electroshock room. Crowe sat in the chair, his shoulder bandaged crudely with strips of his own shirt, looking pale but serene. He held a detonator in his hand. "I wired the building, Alex," he said calmly. "If you shoot me, I drop this. We both become ashes, or you can listen to my final confession." Vane aimed his weapon, center mass. "You don't have the guts to die," Vane said. Crowe smiled. "Test me." The standby lights on the detonator blinked red, a single heartbeat away from oblivion for them both. "You won't do it," Vane said, lowering his gun slightly but keeping it ready. "You're a narcissist, Silas. You need an audience. You need to be remembered. If you blow this place up, you become a footnote, a cinder. No legacy, no fear, just a ghost that nobody fears anymore because it's gone." Crowe's finger trembled on the trigger. The psychology was a gamble, a high-stakes read. "You left the finger at the dock because you wanted to be caught," Vane continued, stepping closer. "You wanted me to chase you, to understand you, but blowing us up, that's not art, that's failure. That's admitting you lost." Crowe's eyes widened, tears of rage forming. "I never lose," he screamed. In that moment of pure emotional fracture, he made the mistake. He stood up from the chair, raising the detonator high to show his dominance, exposing his wounded shoulder and chest. He wanted to tower over Vane, to assert control, but the movement jarred the wound. He flinched, his grip loosened for a millisecond. Vane fired, not a kill shot, he aimed for the hand. The bullet shattered Crowe's wrist, the detonator fell. Crowe howled, clutching his ruined hand, blood spurting between his fingers. Vane kicked the detonator away and tackled him to the ground. The mistake was physical and psychological. He had let arrogance override survival. As Vane cuffed his other hand to the chair, he whispered, "Checkmate." The trial was a media circus, but Vane didn't attend. He let the evidence speak. The finger, the DNA, the fingerprints on the detonator, the testimony of Sarah, the rescued girl. Silas Crowe was sentenced to solitary confinement in a supermax facility, a cage within a cage, his medical license revoked, his name synonymous with horror. But Vane knew that as long as Crowe breathed, the game wasn't truly over. He visited him once 6 months later. Behind the thick glass, Crowe looked smaller, pale, his hand a clawed ruin. "Are you sleeping, Alex?" Crowe asked through the phone. "Do you still see me?" I see a caged animal, Vane replied. And animals in cages die eventually. Crowe smiled that terrible smile. We'll see. The visit ended. Vane tried to rebuild his life. He retired from the force, took up woodworking, moved to a cabin in the mountains. He married Corinne again. They tried to heal, but the jasmine scent still lingered in his nightmares. 2 years after the conviction, a letter arrived at the cabin. No postage, no return address, just a single elegant line. The final act isn't performed by me. Vane's blood ran cold. He called the prison. Crowe was dead. Suicide, they said, hung with a strip of bedsheet, but Vane knew. He knew the game was still running, the final dominoes falling. He looked at the letter again, realizing that the ink was fresh, and the paper was the same expensive cotton stock from the original letters. Vane returned to the city, to the asylum where it had ended. The building was being demolished, but he slipped past the workers. He went to the electroshock room, in the wall. Behind a loose brick, the same one he had removed years ago, he found a small bundle, a phone, a prepaid burner, and a note. Press play. Vane pressed the power button. A video loaded. It was Crowe, filmed months ago in his cell. Speaking calmly to the camera. If you're watching this, Alex, I'm either free or dead. If I'm dead, you won because I made another mistake. I trusted the wrong guard. Or I let the despair win, but I promised you a final act. Look behind you. Vane spun around. The room was empty. On the video, Crowe laughed. Not there. Look at the list. The patients, the ones I cured. Vane realized with dawning horror that Crowe hadn't been idle in prison. He had been treating other inmates legally as a prison doctor, twisting their minds. Creating disciples. The suicide was a transfer of power. The killings started again a week later. Copycats, but perfect ones, trained by Crowe's notes. His mind living on Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. The mistake Vane had counted on Crowe's death was just another move. The king was off the board. But the pieces kept advancing. Vane stood in the ruins of the asylum as the wrecking ball swung, knowing he had to start the hunt all over again, this time for a ghost with many faces. The copycats were clever, but they lacked the original's flair. Vane tracked them down one by one with ruthless efficiency born of betrayal. He flushed them out of hiding spots, a basement in Queens, a storage unit in Brooklyn. Each wore the gray coat, each used the jasmine cologne, but they were flawed, human, catchable. Within a month, 3 were dead in shootouts, 2 in custody. But the last one, the protege, was different. He had learned too well. He kidnapped Corinne. The video arrived at Vane's cabin. Corinne bound, the spiral carved shallowly into her arm, not deep enough to kill, just to mark. The voice was synthesized, but the words were Crowe's, pre-recorded or memorized. Come home, Alex, the final chapter. Vane drove back to the city faster than the law allowed, his heart a stone. He arrived at his old house, the one where Crowe had left the rose. It was empty, dark. In the bedroom, Corinne lay on the bed, unconscious but breathing. Alive, and on the pillow beside her not a knife but a key. A key to the room Vane stood in. He realized the trap too late. The door slammed shut, locked from the outside. Gas began hissing from the vents, odorless, sweet. Crowe's final lesson. The teacher dies, but the lesson outlives him. Vane smashed the window with a chair, clearing the air, scooping Corinne up, but the house was rigged. The explosion knocked him into the yard, shielding her with his body. Silence. Vane lay in the grass, his back burned, his ears ringing. The house was a pillar of fire. Corinne stirred in his arms, alive. He looked up at the tree line. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the flames, the final disciple, or perhaps Crowe himself, if the death had been faked. Vane reached for his weapon, but it was gone. The figure raised a hand in a mockery of a wave, then disappeared. No, Vane wouldn't let him go. He forced himself up, ignoring the agony, and ran. He ran until his lungs burned, chasing the shadow through the woods, catching him at the edge of a cliff. It wasn't Crowe. It was a boy, barely 19, eyes wide with fanaticism. He said you'd come, the boy said. He said you'd chase me right to the edge. Vane stopped. He's dead. You're being used. The boy smiled. That's the mistake you always make, detective, thinking death ends anything. He stepped back off the cliff into the dark. Vane lunged but caught only air. He stood alone, the fire behind him, the abyss before him. He had won, but the victory tasted like ash. The mistake had been thinking he could kill the idea of the Carver. Ideas live forever. Vane walked back to the ambulance, to his wife, knowing the spiral would never truly end, only tighten, waiting for the next detective to follow the tracks into the dark. He was free, but he would always be looking over his shoulder, forever one step behind the ghost of Silas Crowe.